When you were running around Vegas, you had Elvis. I think Tom Jones was around there as well.
We met at the Riviera one night, and I commented on his cufflinks, and he went, "Here, you have these."
Wow.
Oh, yes. Well, Aquaman, one of my favorite superheroes.
Oh, you mean the Snoop Dogg party?
Yeah, Snoop Dogg, yeah. There's necessarily a reality above just the material reality.
Home protection.
Bow and arrow. I don't know.
Our nation is incredibly strong, but it can easily be brought down from within.
I think we all have a calling to a higher purpose.
And welcome everyone to, I think, the third live Conversations at the Mansion. I'm Rick. I am super excited today to welcome my guest, Brendan Graham Dempsey. He is a writer, poet, and a farmer, and also the director of the Sky Meadow Institute, which we definitely want to get into here in a second. That's an organization dedicated to promoting systems-based thinking about the big things that really matter. He's also the author of a 7-volume Metamodern Spirituality Series, and most recently, the book Metamodernism, the culture logic of cultural logics. And his primary interests include theorizing developments in culture after postmodernism, productively bridging the divide between science and spirituality, and developing sustainable systems for life to flourish. Welcome, Brendan. Great to have you.
Thank you so much. This is really exciting. I appreciate the invitation. Always happy to chat with whoever, whenever, and looking forward to getting into whatever you'd like to cover. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Great to have you. Great to have you. So give us a little bit of a background of your time, where you grew up, how you found yourself at Yale, and how you landed, I guess, in Vermont.
Sure. Yeah. And, I've given a couple iterations of that tale, some in great length. So I'll give you the short version. Probably people watching this are familiar with This Little Corner and Paul Vanderklay and folks like that who've been talking to folks like Pajot, like yourself and others. And so I did a 2-hour long conversation with Paul Vanderklay where I gave, a lot more detail, but the snippets, sort of Spark Notes version. I grew up in a very conservative evangelical home and got really into my Christian faith as a kid, young teenager, and decided that was the avenue that I felt like was worth pursuing for my career, for my life, because that was sort of what I felt like made sense to invest my ultimate time and energy in if it was a matter of ultimate concern. And I tend to do that when I think that something is really, really important. I'll kind of throw myself into it entirely. And so that put me on a trajectory towards becoming a professor of biblical studies and Christian history was what I was sort of aiming towards. Thought I might teach at maybe a Christian seminary or something. And put me on a path for studying the Bible. When I got to university, studied religion, classics, learned the Greek and the Hebrew and that sort of a thing, and got really invested in biblical studies and, basically the whole gamut, everything from the Gospels to, Second Temple Judaism into ancient Israelite history, that sort of a thing. That sort of wound up creating a lot of tensions, fissures, cracks for me the more I kind of studied that stuff, because it kind of diverged in really meaningful ways from the kind of sense of the story that I'd been raised with. And so trying to compare and synthesize the insights of sort of modern historical critical biblical scholarship with some of the traditional devotional lensing on the Christian faith that I had was a very difficult thing for me, and ultimately wasn't able to fully make those two things square, and felt kind of convicted to kind of follow wherever the evidence went, where the truth went, that sort of a thing, which was a difficult break for me, but then forced me to kind of what at the time felt very tragically kind of give up on my career goals of becoming a professor of biblical history and whatnot. That kind of set me on a new path that led through the arts, joined an artist collective for a while, did a lot of reading. And it was through that process of sort of therapeutically working through crises of faith, existential crises, issues of meaning, this sort of a thing, that I felt like I got some clarity around all of that, to some degree, at least the beginnings of clarity. And I felt like that was the beginning of an opportunity to sort of re-explore the issues of religion in an academic context, but from a very different angle. And so I found a degree program called Religion and the Arts at Yale Divinity School, and that seemed to speak to the kinds of interests that were really calling to me. And so, after 4 years in that artist collective, I got my master's at Yale Divinity School, worked with some really great people there, and learned a lot. And that was sort of how that all unfolded. So kind of through traditional religion into sort of the modern historical critical stuff, and then into some more aesthetic and artistic and kind of other ways in the symbolic, I guess I would say as well, ways of relating to issues of meaning, purpose, religion, spirituality. And so now the work that I'm doing is in the field of what's called metamodern spirituality, at least that's what I'm calling it, which is an attempt to sort of get the best of all of those modes of thinking, the traditional, the modern, the postmodern, and somehow find a kind of very robust form of meaning and purpose on the other side of all those really kind of heady critiques. So that's my life in a nutshell.
Okay. And so what was your canvas of choice? Were you a sculptor, painter? What kind of art bent did you have?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've dabbled in a lot of different media over the years, but I would say principally I think of myself, I suppose, as a poet, certainly as an author. But when I was living at that artist collective, I was writing an epic poem, actually, in blank verse, trying to navigate these issues in sort of a literary way. And so I wound up writing this 500-page epic poem called God. And that was, again, very kind of cathartic, therapeutic for me. And there's something about working within a medium like that is somehow constraining, but also liberating through the constraints, which I greatly appreciated. So I would say I'm certainly in the literary end of things, but I also dabble a bit in the visual arts as well, but principally literary.
Yeah, so you're a man of the language. What were the initial influences on you to have this sort of bent towards poetry? I mean, are you sort of a 1200s to 1600s type of poetry guy? Or are you more modern than that?
Gosh. Yeah, I mean, so I would say my huge influences were Keats, and then that led to Milton. And then, I love the kind of romantic era in general. So Byron, Shelley, those folks. My interest began to taper off a lot in the early 20th century in terms of those fellows, because a lot of free verse starts to become the norm then. And while there are incredible free verse poets out there, I really enjoy form, and I enjoy meter. And I think Robert Frost famously quipped that, writing poetry in free verse is like playing tennis with the net down. And there was always an element of that it kept me more in the realm of the 19th century poets and before, but of course Shakespeare as well. I mean, Shakespeare, Marlowe, those folks. So I would say kind of mostly in the modern era.
Yeah. I think it was Eugene Peterson that said that we were created to live rhythmically. And I always think about that. I'm a musician myself. Well, old musician. So in college I was a trumpet performance major, and so I think we probably think a lot alike concerning creativity and sort of the theory and the philosophy of the arts and their function as sort of a reflection of creation, but also a reflection of story as well. And so I suspect that your attention to rhythm and rhyme is probably a corollary to the instrumentalists concentration on the same two, the rhythm and the rhyme.
Yeah, I think it really depends. The rhythm is huge, and of course, when you're writing something like blank verse, it doesn't in that particular format. You're not rhyming so much, though. I do also really enjoy. I used to really enjoy a lot writing sonnets and villanelles and sestinas, that sort of a thing. There's a very wonderful dynamic interplay and a kind of creative puzzle that also, in its best form, right, kind of disappears as a kind of intellectual or mechanical problem. It's sort of in the same way that if you kind of practice your scales enough, right, then you can kind of go up on the stage and you can just solo and it just kind of flows out. And I think that there's a really magical thing that can happen when you hone your craft, hopefully, and then and then things flow. And there's there's a great value, I think, in working within certain kinds of strictures and constraints and seeing how those can actually generate sort of a surplus, dynamic that in a very interesting way isn't really possible sometimes without those constraints. So, yeah.
What is your philosophy of negative space? And let me give you some context and some people that are watching. From a sort of art designer's perspective, the negative space is generally sort of the blank space on the canvas, right? Whenever I write, I'm in the process of writing my first book.
Cool.
I think I'm getting ready to hit 800 pages, and market's down to 300 pages. So I gotta kill 500 pages of love there somehow. But so I'm working on that. But the negative space, that white space around the text, is so important in my opinion. What is sort of your philosophy as a writer, a poet, a theologian, a philosopher on sort of the negative space, the stuff that you don't say?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I really came to appreciate those kinds of things from people like Hemingway, right? You could read a whole book of Hemingway, and actually it's entirely what has never been said in the book itself that is basically what the book is about. So those kinds of things can be very interesting. Ooh, wow. Yeah, I wasn't expecting to get into aesthetic philosophy. This is interesting. I think that there's always that balance, I suppose, that you have to do of showing, telling, that sort of a thing. And you want to optimally do both in equal, or no, I shouldn't say equal, but in sort of proportional measure. You want the right kind of, balance or harmony between what you're saying and what you're not saying. I think it's very easy, especially when you're just getting started as a writer, maybe to just, want to throw everything onto the page. And then it's like learning constraint. It's like learning more and more what you don't have to say to really make things land. That's sort of things. I think that's a lot of what comes out of just general, sort of artistic mastery over years of, or mastery obviously is like what one aims for, obviously, but let's just say increasing competence. Like the same is true with music. I think that I play the saxophone as well, and play some jazz music and whatnot. Yeah. And there's an easy tendency of wanting to get on stage and then just play every note, and then you'll hear a solo sometime where you hear this restraint from the soloist, where they're just giving you just a little bit, and then they're able to develop something, and then it flows into this very intricate, this sort of, it has a kind of composition to it that obviously just you lack if you're just putting it all out there. And so, there's always this kind of dialectical back and forth trade-off between, what you're revealing, what you're keeping hidden, and that sort of a thing. I think that the facility with those sorts of dynamics just kind of comes with time, hopefully. Yeah.
Are there specific saxophonists that you like to listen to?
Oh gosh. Yeah. Well, I mean, gosh. I like a lot of kind of more like jazz fusion stuff. And so obviously there are the greats, Charlie Parker, everyone loves some good bebop.
Some good ornithology, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, Charlie Parker, obviously, Coltrane, the classics, those folks. So I do really enjoy the kind of, the kind of really seminal, incredible jazz musicians. But I also enjoy folks like Jeff Coffin, who, like, for example, was the saxophone player for Bela Fleck and the Flecktones. Gosh, who are some others? There's, I don't know.
Is Kirk Whalum still around?
I don't know. Never heard.
Okay.
My father's also a saxophonist, and he knows a lot more of the names of folks and stuff. It's actually been a while. I also listen to a lot of classical music, a lot of bluegrass music, and that sort of a thing. And so it's been a while since I've really deeply delved into the jazz scene. So some of those names have flitted from my memory.
Yeah, I'm 25 years removed myself too, so I'm right there with you. What do you listen to while you write?
Depends. I mean, classical music's great. It depends on what I'm writing. It depends on, when I was writing that epic, for example, there are different scenes going on. And so, if I was writing like a War in Heaven scene, I remember listening to Mars by Gustav Holst over and over again to kind of get that vibe going. Or like there are kind of certain mystical moments that occur in that text as well. And there are a couple of compositions, pieces by like Sigur Rós and this Icelandic band called Moom. This kind of weird post-rock stuff that like really, I don't know, just puts me in the right headspace to go mystical. So that kind of depends. These days, I'm of course writing a lot more nonfiction. Well, yeah, I'm writing a lot of nonfiction and a lot of works on spirituality, meaning, value, complexity, stuff like that. And there, it's much more just sort of whatever Spotify wants to throw my way. Usually in some kind of airy, ambient kind of vibe that isn't too intrusive for my thought space.
Yeah, yeah. The algo, I use Google Music, and the algo got me hooked on Dua Lipa. Now I'm a dad of 3 girls, and so we have a heavy Taylor Swift household, and the fact that I am now addicted to Dua Lipa. In fact, that's all that Google will play for me. And of course, I obey my master. That has them just they're just aflame about that. They're so upset that Dad likes Dua Lipa now.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't say I listen to much Dua Lipa myself, but but you got to follow where the algo leads, I guess.
Yes. So walk me through I'm a simple business guy. I sit at a desk most days. Walk me through where we are currently from your perspective, philosophically, because I think just generally, a lot of us that aren't paying attention every day, we knew that we were sort of in a pre-modernity sometime between 0 and 1600, somewhere in that phase. Then we finally got into modernity for about 300 or 400 years. And then we started getting into post-modernity over the last, 75-ish years, something like that. But it seems a lot of things have changed over the last handful of years, especially with this meaning crisis that's occurred. There's been sort of a acceleration from what I can see from the outside. But would you just take a few minutes, please, just sort of walk us through kind of a dummy's guide to where we've come from and where we are right now?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, I could kind of go through, those different kind of cultural epochs, if you will.
That'd be great.
Yeah. Okay. So, again, I always usually tend to caveat this by saying, these are heuristics. They're broad strokes kinds of characterizations. And, one can always dig into the details and nuance these kinds of accounts, and should. But if you're looking for something of sort of an orienting generalization around these topics, I think that we can meaningfully do something like that. And it's very helpful for being able to kind of situate ourselves in time and kind of know where we've been and potentially then where we're going. So the pre-modern, as you say, we'll just use the time frames that you use, because I think those are good kind of chunks to separate this into. So let's just say the form of pre-modernity that characterized that period of 0 to 1600, let's say. And here we'll talk principally from kind of a Western perspective, though I think you can make cross-cultural kinds of comparisons as well, but that's a different conversation. So we'll just speak primarily about the West. And that's very, I think the sort of vibe or, zeitgeist, the kind of ethos of it, we have in mind when we imagine the Middle Ages, the kind of, the European world is very much, sort of oriented around the Christian religion and the church and its, calendar. Obviously, it's a predominantly rural society, so there's farming and feudalism, and forms of government being essentially monarchies, that sort of a thing. And you've got sort of this very kind of cyclical sense of things. Things move with the seasons. There's a deep kind of connection with the natural rhythms of nature and sort of the cycle of things. And there's a sense too that things don't change much. That the rate of change, if it's even sort of detectable over a human life, is rather small. And so a lot of this gives credence to a way of looking at the world that's very much sort of, this is the way it is and this is the way it's always been, or something like that. That there's a kind of fundamental reality to the social organization, and there's a sense of things as everything kind of having the right place because of that. So there's a kind of grand natural scale scale of nature or natural kind of great chain of being that leads, from kind of the king at the top of the social hierarchy that kind of goes down into the nobility and the peasantry and that sort of a thing. And then the king is sort of the mediator also towards, more kind of heavenly, realms that then goes up into the angels and the celestial hierarchy and ultimately to God. And you get a wonderful, depiction of all this in, say, Dante's comedy, written, in the early 14th century. So something like that worldview seems to characterize a kind of pre-modern, Christian Western Europe frame anyway. Though you can also, again, and it is worth mentioning, appreciate other ways that this panned out in other parts of the world. And I think the biggest thing there to appreciate is that there's some sense of like an overarching order or a deep kind of transcendental kind of governing principle to reality, right? So in Christian Europe, that is sort of God and his divine will and all of that. And, but, you could go further east and see things like Tien, like heaven, as being that sort of orienting, transcendental principle, the Tao, etc. There's this period around 500 BC where a lot of the axial age religions, including Christianity, but these others as well, get started. And what seems to unite them all is the sense that we're kind of in the world, but then there's something beyond the world. There's kind of like another realm, and that's kind of the basis of this whole sacred thing.
Yeah, let me jump in real quick with a question here. So it seems to me that there's sort of this mediating type of function in most of the religions, even going back, 5,000 years ago with the Egyptian, with the king being sort of the intercessor between the people and the gods. Maybe even 50,000 years going back to the Japanese bear cults, where they would go up on the mountains to worship, well, at least knowing the bears were up in the mountains, or thinking the bears should be up in the mountains. And obviously the mountains are always sort of the halfway point between heaven and earth. Is the idea sort of the mediator, whether it be a king or something else, has that been sort of prevalent in all cultures? Just kind of what I'm seeing.
That's a good question. So the thing about the pre-modern or pre-modernity is that actually it's kind of a stand-in for there are other ways you can subdivide even that category, right? And so actually when you're talking about things before modernity, there were a couple of distinct kind of cultural codes holding together certain kinds of social organizations. And so the one I was just describing of sort of, Western Christian Europe is sort of what you could say characterized one form of that from around, let's just say 500 BC on. Something, again, these are very rough dates, but before that, when you go further back to those periods you're talking about, whether it's ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia, these kind of early agricultural civilizations, you actually get kind of a different configuration, and it is much more what you say, that there's an emphasis on sort of the mediating figure, which is the god king usually, but there's sort of an intricate complex of king and temple, basically the religious bureaucracy and the kind of political bureaucracy. And it's very much this sort of sharp hierarchy that leads there. And there's a kind of administrative mediation function between these elites and everyone else. But if you go before that, you go into like Neolithic societies, or you go into, various forms of hunter-gatherer societies. That kind of sharp hierarchy actually doesn't exist so much in those contexts. So, and a lot of the anthropological data that we have around, more modern forager and hunter-gatherer societies tends to suggest they're a lot more egalitarian. And in those contexts, which is much more of the way that people would have been living, basically from, let's just say, 10,000 BC and before, then you've got these sort of small groups of people who there might be some social stratification, but it's largely egalitarian. And you might have someone like a shaman or a figure who does sort of do a mediating function, but it's not really related much to political power, because that doesn't exist so much. It's more about this person has powers, or this person has capacities to do these things. So the idea of like the mediation between kind of everyone else and this other sacred world, that kind of carries through, but the ways that changes relative to the social configuration and complexity is a really interesting thing, and one of the things that is part of my studies. Yeah. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And let me just jump in here before we move on. If anyone wants to comment or have questions, feel free to comment. I know the Rumble stream went down, so we don't have the Rumblers over there, but I think we're still live on the Facebook and the YouTube and maybe even LinkedIn. And so we should be, and even Twitter, I think we should be rolling there. So feel free to ask some questions. I saw my buddy Paul Campbell, who is a Shinto follower. His wife and family are Japanese, so I immediately thought of the Japanese bear cults. I don't get very many opportunities to drop my limited knowledge on Japanese religion, but there you go. So all right, so we've got a pretty good handle on where we've been up to around that time. And so how did we begin evolving? Because it's both like sort of philosophical and also cultural, and probably something else, probably some sort of axiomatic evolution at some point.
Yeah, I mean, you could. It's a whole other conversation and a fascinating and important one to talk about why cultures evolve as they do. So it's one thing to sort of describe, historically what we see happening, but the whys are a much deeper question, which we can maybe come back to or save for some other time.
Absolutely.
But so what you do start to see around that period that you mentioned, though, even before, basically you get the High Middle Ages, then you get the kind of early Renaissance period and so on, and then things start to pick up from there into the Enlightenment, and then you're into kind of full-blown modernity. So I think, a few important changes occur. And I think let's see, it's always difficult, to think about like where to start with these sorts of things, because they're obviously networked and they're all interrelated to each other. But I think if you're trying to think about sort of the shift in worldview that occurs in the pre-modern framework, things are largely like knowledge is largely based on tradition, and it's largely based on authority. So if the priest says it, or whatever the king does, etc., these sorts of like the divine sanction of that whole kind of hierarchy is the kind of legitimization of certain kinds of knowledge transmission. One of the things that begins to really change in a big way in the early modern period is that people question those authorities and legitimization structures, and they start asking their own critical questions and critically, independently scrutinizing information, texts, etc. And so, going back to people like Francis Bacon, but then into folks like Galileo, on into Newton, right? One of the major things that they're starting to do is experiments, or you look at someone like René Descartes, kind of the father of modern philosophy, and he's saying that we should doubt everything. We actually have to question everything, and then see if we can build up from there, which is a very different kind of approach to knowledge than what had been. And so when you do get people asking critical questions, applying critical scrutiny, being skeptical, looking for evidence, and doing experiments, you start to see the nascent emergence of what we now call kind of science, basically, which then, as that kind of gets unfolding, does a couple of things. One is that it starts to shift, again, the way that people are thinking about these things, at least in sort of more intellectual circles. It also becomes the means by which new technologies can emerge, which then themselves wind up shaping the kind of cultural and physical landscape in a way that affects the way people see the world. So you get the rise of the early industrialization of Europe and that sort of a thing, which will eventually, of course, spread all over the world. And increasingly, the consequence of all these developments is that people see the world much more in terms of mechanism, cause, like mechanical cause and effect, right? You get this sort of clockwork sense of the universe, because before there was a lot more of a sense that things were mysterious and God works in mysterious ways, miracles happen, this and that. By the time you're moving into the modern period, people are focusing much more on what's the actual specific kind of causal mechanism behind a given thing. And so, there's this gesture towards some notion of like everything's billiard balls on a table, right? Everything has a kind of direct causal impact. And, there's a guy named Laplace, who's like a intellectual and an early scientist in the Napoleonic era, who basically says it as much, that basically if you had a mind that knew the location of all the particles in the universe, and that mind would basically know everything, because everything would just sort of be determined, and you could just have a sense of everything that's going on, because everything is just this mechanical cause and effect. So that's a big way that the modern world tends to just like revolutionize the way people see things. And because of that, then the the notion of God actually becomes sort of deeply challenged, right? So actually another thing that Laplace says to Napoleon is, God, sire, I have no use of that hypothesis, right? It's sort of this notion that like, well, this becomes a superfluous idea when we have the efficient causal explanations for everything that occurs, right? And so that's a lot of that early, kind of optimistic, scientistic, you could say, modern thought that that kind of radicalizes this new insight about causality and mechanics. And so that unfolds. And if, by the way, feel free to interrupt me at any point.
So where we're at right now, based off the sort of the story, this narrative that you're giving us, just from a simpleton's understanding, it sounds like we were steeped in the spiritual, the imaginative, the mythical prior to this, and there's been some swap out of that into more mechanical causation. And I always think mechanical causation is beneath the dignity of mankind. Me sitting in the 21st century, I say that, but it seems like we've been like there was a desire to turn the man more into a calculating machine using this causal logic, and that seemed to have run rampant up until we get to minds like Chesterton and obviously Einstein. But it seems to me that it's more of an abasement of humanity that transpired, but maybe they didn't realize it because they had the art covering it, or what? How do you read that?
Yeah, so I think the best way to read it is that every cultural transformation comes with its own, you could say dignities and pitfalls. If you want to talk about the pitfalls of modernity, you're gesturing towards them for sure. And ever since even really the Romantics, who were already responding to the Enlightenment thinkers, you get these kinds of critiques, which is that modernity has this drive towards standardization and kind of removing the particularity of everything, trying to answer everything with some absolute solution, trying to mechanize everything, as you say, make people calculators, that sort of a thing. And so by the time you get to the 20th century and the sort of radical industrialized sort of grid-like standardification of everything, you do see a lot of the downsides of the modern project. And also, that doesn't begin to mention any of the things like all the quote unquote external costs, in terms of the pollution and the destruction of natural resources and the kind of imperialism and colonialism that kind of goes on and all this stuff. But we'll probably touch on those briefly when I talk about postmodernity. But the other thing is that that modernity comes with incredible dignities, right? So here we are having a conversation based off this incredible technology, based off of the insights of scientists and the people who have discovered these natural forces and natural laws. And that's a very remarkable thing that clearly we value, the ability to basically experience most everything that we're experiencing right now, the electrical light in my lamp, and the fact that I recently broke my hand, but now I am healthy again, and the joys of modern medicine. I have clearly I can't see very well without these. I could go on and on and on, right? So the ability to dissect the specific causal variables in a situation, zoom in on them, and then take care of those things and see the specific, as I say, kind of causal aspects for things, is an incredibly powerful tool that has the capacity to dramatically enhance our quality of life. And that would be one of the dignities of modernity. And the other thing, too, is that, and I would make this point, but here we might begin to disagree on some of this, is that a lot of the ways in which modernity forced pre-modern religious thought to grapple with issues it hadn't been aware of before, I think is also an incredibly valuable contribution in a way that I ultimately tend to view as contributing to the spiritual unfolding and development of sort of humanity's history. So, there's that sort of thing, right? If you're kind of naive to a problem, you might be able to kind of have that, ignorance is bliss experience, right? But do we want to be living in ignorance, or do we want to know more? And sometimes when we know more, it creates cognitive dissonance, challenges to our worldview, et cetera, et cetera. And so, if we do hold to a value of truth, and if there is something deeply valuable about knowing what the truth is, then I do think also that modernity put some great pressures on a lot of the naive assumptions of the pre-modern era and forced it to grapple with things that, did initially create a lot of tensions and maybe some breakdown of really important structures. But I tend to see all that as part of a continual, ongoing process of reconstruction and reconfiguration towards a deeper understanding of the truth. So, yeah.
And you're still speaking when you say religion and you're talking about modernity, pre-modernity. You're speaking basically about the church, like the Catholic Church, from the Western standpoint. You're talking about sort of religion, the nature of spirituality globally.
Well, in this context, because the Protestant Reformation, of course, doesn't really get going until the early, 1500s. So, and you can actually see the Protestant Reformation as itself deeply a kind of modern project in many ways. And that there's a whole conversation to be had around that. But I guess for the bulk of that period that we're talking about, it's mostly the Catholic Church, but also the Catholic Church itself underwent a very and is still undergoing centuries of development and change. So even when we talk about the Catholic Church, that's not a monolith either. But I think that whether it's the Catholic or the Protestant, whether it's Christian or whether it's religion in general, I think the same issue does apply, which is that modernity places a kind of justification pressure on religious thought in a way that it hadn't contended with before, where, for example, if you know the causal linkages of things and that gives you causal power in the world to create light and, heal yourself, this sort of a thing, then when you turn to like someone operating in a kind of traditional religious mindset, and then you say, well, how did X, Y, and Z happen? And they'd say, I don't know, it was a miracle. I don't know, it's a mystery, right? Like it doesn't have the same, then they're sort of like, well, wait a second, you're talking about healing using, rituals and this and that, but I can heal people. I can predict a solar eclipse, et cetera, et cetera. So the causal power that the modern project begins to introduce with its developments is you could say a challenge to traditional forms of thought. But that's just the beginning of it. Yeah.
And it seems to me that you mentioned Dante's comedy, kind of the 12th, 13th century around there out of Florence. And it seems to me the church, religion at this time in the Western world, that the tiny city of Florence really made, and please forgive me for saying this, really made the Catholic Church its bitch. Florence dominated Rome for probably 250, 300 years. I mean, you look at the art. I mean, look at Dante alone. You've got these three sets of with 33 cantos, 33 and 34 cantos making up the Divine Comedy. He forced Rome to start using the Florentine version of Italian. I mean, it's and then you look at the popes that were installed by the sheer brilliance of the bankers of Florence, the Medicis, and then they installed two of their own family members, a son and then a nephew, as popes. After bribing a long-term popes. And so I look at this and like that stopped. I'm guessing sort of the mid 1400s, early 1500s, sometime in there. Would be my guess when the tampering stopped. But it seems like they propped up religion in the West through just outright bitchery for a couple of centuries there.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the interesting things, right, is that one of the characteristic transformations from the pre-modern into the modern is you see that commercial interests overtake the authority and the power of religious interests, right? And what you're speaking to is a great example of that. So the rise of the House of Medici through banking and through the incredible enrichment that they were able to do by, and this is also an important aspect, by essentially right, banking's based on interest, and interest had been a sin in the Catholic Church for a long time. It was called usury. You weren't supposed to do that. So you start to see these changes of the way that people are thinking about money. In fact, even in the Divine Comedy, people are in hell for doing usury because it's deemed this unnatural proliferation of money, sort of a thing. It's a very interesting thing. But so what happens, though, out of a lot of that is that you see the rise of capitalism, the rise of before a certain period of time, people didn't conceive of the idea that, like, let's just say that you could get interest from your loans, and that you could and in fact, also a lot of that, well, we're getting into the weeds now, but a lot of that also was the select purview of Jewish communities at the time, who had been, of course, ostracized and exiled from a lot of the normal kinds of commercial activity, and didn't have the same, sort of prohibition against usury. And so they actually were able to, lend money at interest. And then you get, if you read like Merchant of Venice, for example, all of that. And so anyway, long story short, that shift that you're describing, where these bankers in Florence who are able to enrich themselves through this nascent kind of proliferation through interest and capital, that is part and parcel of sort of the transformation from the pre-modern into the modern. And of course, many times the popes who were going to war were begging the Medici for money, and this sort of a thing. So
for the Catholic Church's own money, like they're begging for the Catholic Church's own money, and they use the Catholic Church's own money to bribe and install the next pope.
Sure.
That's the brilliance of the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really it's a very fascinating period of history, and I mean, the whole transformation of the papacy even is a fascinating thing. You think like Pope Julius II, for example, was called the warrior pope, and he was out there fighting wars, taking over parts of Italy. It's a fascinating period, and of course, you mentioned you've got the Borgia popes, you've got the Medici popes. So that's kind of an interesting moment in early modernity, where these two kind of world systems are kind of figuring things out together in a way that, now when we look back, we see what has sort of come from that, which is that the kind of earthly power of politics and governance and commercialization, that sort of a thing, that is sort of the kind of secular sphere, and then the religious sphere is sort of like operating within the space that the secular sphere has, like, kind of deigns for it to operate in, so to speak. Well, that's probably a bit uncharitable way of putting it, but and that was sort of the beginning of a lot of this. And so capitalism, really takes off in the 1600s, 1700s, and so on, and fuels the industrialization. And the way that also then the capitalist mindset, and then also as it's inflected through kind of nationalism and imperialism evolve, those are all deeply formative of sort of Western modernity, and the way that people tend to now see the world as being about a move towards progress, greater accumulation of resources, increasing the quality of life, increasing wealth, increasing power, that sort of a thing, and a profound move from sort of transcendental concerns to immanent worldly concerns. And that's where a lot of the kind of disenchantment and the kind of the rise of the secular sphere and all this stuff, this sort of general decline of the religious world as the world, and the rise of the secular world as being kind of the world in which religion now operates.
Yeah, and I think the irony of that is that you look at the New Testament, it's always meant that the secular world be kind of the real world that you operate in. It's not the other way around. And so is this at this point where you just left off? Is this where you think modernity sort of peaks? Like, is this beginning? Like, are we whiffing the downfall of modernity this early on, or does that happen later?
Well, I mean, obviously, all that would be a qualitative assessment. So there's something subjective about assessing, where do things peak and that sort of thing. Some people could say it's still peaking, right? I mean, look at all the developments that are still going on. I think we're still very much in a very modernized world, and in many ways, the most disruptive aspects of contemporary society continue to be modernization dynamics of industrialization. I mean, look at China. I mean, China is going through its own rapid modernization in a few decades, basically, with compared to what Europe did in a couple centuries, right? So so all that's still happening. In terms of where I think things reach a kind of self-reflective critical impasse, might be another way of framing it, is in the 20th century. Because this whole narrative of progress and development and growth and all this stuff seems really great, and you get these sort of ideologies of progress. But then when you get to the 20th century, you get these massive world wars, you get tens of millions of people dead, and you get Hiroshima, Nagasaki, et cetera, and a lot of people reflect on that as kind of the failure of modernity, as sort of there's this kind of pause after the Second World War and a kind of critical stance of, well, if this is where all our technology got us and all our knowledge, we basically ended in barbarism, and not enlightenment, and so this really savage critique of modernity starts to begin as a whole project around this period. And you get people in like the Frankfurt School and, Adorno and Horkheimer and negative dialectics and dialectics of enlightenment, all this stuff, which is really the early, postmodern framework proper in some ways. So, so we're at that point, you're kind of starting to get into postmodern thought. And the taking of modernity itself as sort of a collective set of ideas and institutions and concepts, and then critiquing them and seeing, whether or not they live up to their ideals and so forth. And a lot of the postmodern project then is about trying to lay bare the failures of modernity, trying to problematize its assumptions, trying to emphasize all of the voices that were left out of modernity or who were trampled by it. And so you get then post-colonial thought, right? And sort of the critiques of imperialism and colonialism. You get the civil rights movement, for example, and the emphasis on trying to extend, the liberation to oppressed people. And so this is a big part of the postmodern sort of zeitgeist. But another thing that goes on is a critique of sort of modernism's optimism about knowledge and, the scientific project specifically. Like, do we actually know what we know? Or isn't the scientific frame itself just a frame among other frames? Who's to say? The scientists? There's sort of a skepticism and a concern about how people adjudicate what is true, what's false. And a lot of the kind of conclusion around these issues is that, well, isn't it kind of convenient that it's those with power who tend to make these decisions about these things? And so you wind up getting a rather skeptical, cynical, hermeneutics of suspicion that really, drills down hard into the interrogation of certain kind of modern sacred cows and the challenging of those ideas, including those of progress and certain forms of, Western supremacy and other forms of sort of supremacist and colonialist and imperialist thought with this radical relativism, which is to say, you guys are no better than anyone else, and you're asserting that there even is a better and a worse in this way is just sort of a power move, etc. So in short, the postmodern then sort of responds to, reacts to, tries to negate the modern and challenges a lot of its assumptions with a lot of criticism, skepticism, cynicism, so forth.
And so would you put the entirety, or I guess the preponderance of the reflection on the changes, or at least the witness of the changes to the moral structure, the gulags and the concentration camps and Nagasaki, Hiroshima, that was sort of the reflection, the inflection point for that pivot? Was it a moral pivot primarily, but then it impacted all the other realms?
I think that was a big aspect to the mainstreaming of postmodern critiques, I guess I would say. I mean, you have people asking philosophical questions before this period that don't necessarily take root, in the academy in the same way. I mean, people like Wittgenstein, and you can go back even earlier than that. I mean, you get these art movements that are kind of proto-postmodern in their, like the Dadaists and some of the surrealist stuff and whatnot. People are doing these things in different registers, but I think if you're looking for sort of the point at which postmodern culture starts to become like a meaningful term, I think that really is a kind of post-war phenomenon. And yeah, there are many ways that could be parsed and the kinds of interpretations for it. But that's the one that seems to land most for me. I think David Harvey is someone who emphasizes that in particular in his book, The Condition of Postmodernity, I think it's called. And so, there's another thing which can easily be overemphasized, but I think there's a component to this as well, which is that eventually after World War II, you do get the Cold War, and then you get the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in terms of that particular time period, there's some way in which there's a kind of leftist politics that is trying to sort of gain a sense of orientation, I guess, in some ways, because kind of classical Marxism had proven itself to be deeply problematic in sort of its more traditional forms, and had become totalitarian and things. And so people were, I think, engaged in a different kind of project that was also critical of Marxism. And again, I mentioned like the Frankfurt School and folks who are trying to grapple with, like, in some ways, the failure of certain attempts to implement communism. And there is something, I think, I mean, this is the first time I've talked about this element, so I'm welcome to be critiqued on this. And I think folks like Stephen Hicks, I think, make this point too far. But I think there is an element to which, there's a way in which the postmodern project somehow becomes a reflection on the failures of Marxism and an attempt to kind of reboot in a new way around different kinds of issues, but using similar kinds of structures, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I'm sure you being in Vermont and you're sitting U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, he'd been in the Senate for 50 years by the time 1950 rolled around. I mean, he's been in the Senate for 124 years already. So he would know. He would be able to tell us how all that played out back then.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure if he's that old. He is. I mean, like them all, he's quite elderly. So.
Oh no, I'm sure he saw the 1600 transition to modernity too. He's been around. That guy's been around forever.
Hate his politics or love his politics. He is a national treasure, though. You got if for the memes only. I mean, that he's a. Well, I don't want to get on a political avenue or trajectory here. I think that might derail the narrative of modernism and that sort of a thing. But anyway, go on.
What is there to discuss other than religion and politics? I mean, there's nothing, else to discuss.
Sex, religion, and politics is what are the three things you're never supposed to discuss. But that was always the stuff that always seemed to come up around the family dinner table. So I'm happy to go all.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm waiting for as you walk us through postmodernity into metamodernity is I'm waiting to find out if there's a role for morality as well. That's sort of what I'm waiting for, because I'm thinking back to, I'm sure some of the viewers are thinking the same thing, thinking back to sort of the tampering of the church with Florence, the work there to kind of manipulate religion there. As the precursor, is potentially one of the precursors to modernity, Nagasaki, Gulag, concentration camps as potentially a precursor, or at least a reflection point to get into postmodernity. And so I'm waiting. I'm sure others are waiting to find out if there's a role for morality, or is there some other sort of pivot point as we move out of postmodernity.
Yeah, well. So up front, yes, I think so. And that's a big part of my work, is to try to make sense of what we mean by morality, ethics, value, those kinds of things. And I think that, as I'll touch on in a second, that's a big part of various kinds of postmodern or metamodern projects to try to articulate those things. So yeah, I guess briefly I'll just say a little bit about where I think metamodernism fits into this picture, and then I'll tackle that head on. So what you get with this sort of postmodern paradigm is, again, both pitfalls and dignities, right? The pitfalls will be probably more clear and obvious to the, this audience, but there are dignities as well. But briefly, I mean, the pitfalls are you get embraced a kind of radical skepticism, the sense that we can't really know anything. Everything is sort of a power play, and you get in virtue of that a sort of abdication of the role of thinking about value, because there is seemingly no value and there's no one to adjudicate value because we're all living in sort of different narratives. We're all just kind of part of different language games, right? And so because of that, the only thing that kind of enters that vacuum that of value is the market. And so you get this sort of rampant neoliberal capitalism that leads to a kind of consumerism of like rampant ecological destruction and sort of unhappy people living in, cramped suburbs and this sort of a thing. And so, the postmodern world then, and its sort of hyperfixation on superficiality, commercialization, this sort of a thing. If you've ever seen the Charlie Brown Christmas special, right? Charlie Brown's going on about, about the commercialization of Christmas. And it's a very kind of like postmodern moment where, everything just becomes an ad. Everything becomes a sitcom send up. Everything is just kind of valueless, meaningless, hollow. And so all you can really do is cynically mock it, etc. So all those things are very corrosive. And of course, there's a lot of fissuring of the social fabric, right? Because you get basically everyone's living in their own relativistic world and there's no truth to unite anything. And so my truth's as good as yours. And so, then you get a kind of, out of that, I think a kind of rabid identity politics that can easily take hold and wind up, really breaking the social fabric in a way that we're experiencing today. And of course, also the very notion of truth itself is questioned, and so you get a kind of post-truth, post-fact kind of world out of all of that. So all those things are bad. But there's some good things, too, that come from postmodernism. And I appreciate an opportunity to say these things as well, because I think a lot of these things get easily glossed over or just not known about or reflected upon too much. But they're really important. And I think a big aspect of that is the increased awareness around our limited frames that we tend to work with, right? Our blind spots. What are our blind spots? And what are we not paying attention to? What are we self-servingly ignoring? Who are we hurting by not being concerned about? How much of our nationalism and our colonialism and our imperialism is hurting the world, right? So you get the whole post-colonial critique, which is deeply valuable for being able to, basically shine a light on the travesty, if that's the right word, the tragedy, the incredible horrors of centuries of, basically just invading other countries and genociding them, taking their natural resources, etc. Right? So like, if we care about truth and justice and morality, right? Like that's a good thing to foreground, because it's like, that's not a good thing. And a lot of that too is also, it expands our frame of reference. The civil rights movement, it was sort of like, who had been left out of the narrative of modernity? How could we as a country, as Americans, say, in our founding charter that everyone was created equal, but then have these deep inequalities, right? So trying to pay attention to those things and fix them, attend to them, is an important kind of legacy of postmodern critique. Being aware of, the way that language structures our worldviews, the way that we participate and show up in cultural contexts in a way that's going to prime us to believe certain things versus others. A lot of the critique of reason itself, to the degree that it's not just ultimate skepticism, is actually really valuable, because a lot of those modern thinkers thought there's one answer for everything. There's sort of this absolute truth, and we'll just kind of get there through progress, right? But actually, truths are often contextual, not in the sense of radical relativism, but in the sense that, let's just say, what's going on in different contexts will influence people differently based on a whole set of factors, and that not all worldview systems are the same, et cetera, et cetera. So just the fact that there are worldviews is kind of a postmodern insight, because the modernists didn't even see that they were necessarily operating from within a worldview. They thought they were just like, oh, well, we're not those stupid, superstitious pre-moderns anymore. Now we've got the right answer. And then the postmoderns come along. They're like, no, you're your own worldview, sort of a thing. So all those things are incredibly valuable, and I could go on. But
was that a function of communication and the visualization? We could see each other, we could talk to each other a little more rapidly than we could 100 years prior. Do you think that had anything to do with it?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, the rise of an information, culture. Yeah, definitely. Mass communication. A classic example, right, is that people had been brutalizing different groups of people forever. I mean, that's what humans have done. But when you looked at like the civil rights movement and you saw police coming in with fire hoses and, doing what they were doing, that was the first time stuff like that had ever been sort of nationally, in the public consciousness in that sort of a way. And so it brought out a kind of, collective conscience about it in a way that wouldn't have been possible absent those kinds of technologies. So definitely the technology has played a big part of that. Mass media in general, is a very kind of postmodern medium in some ways, the medium of television specifically. But so anyway, the idea though, which I keep wanting to emphasize, because I think it's important for the metamodern framing, is that you get these transitions, but then you get pitfalls and you get dignities. You get the good and the bad, the pro and the con. And in a nutshell, again, what metamodernism is sort of trying to do is see what is good in all of these earlier epochs or cultural codes and trying to integrate those into something while also trying to transcend or move beyond the pitfalls, right? So we would love to have electricity and modern medicine, but not colonialism, please. Like that sounds like a good deal. From modernity, from postmodernity, we'd love to have that social contextual awareness and a more expansive set of, human rights and sensitivities to different groups of people and to social context and awareness of the socially constructed aspects of certain kinds of truth claims. Yes, that sounds great. It's inclusive and whatnot, but we'd like to avoid a lot of that sort of tribalistic identity politics, social fracturing, etc. And so how does one move through these cultural codes, building upon their virtues, but, kind of processing and kind of, let's say, metabolizing and ultimately kind of dissipating their kind of pathologies. We don't want the radical skepticism. We don't want the radical relativism of a postmodern society. We see what kind of corrosive impacts that has and what diminishing returns those give us in kind of knowledge production. So the metamodern is sort of like, can we do this best of everything and leave the dross? And that's a big part of what that is. And yeah, I mean, it begins to show up, early in the 2000s. You see metamodern art really show up first, and you see this kind of engagement with both modern and postmodern attitudes at the same time, right? So you get this sort of modern optimism, but you also get it tempered by this sort of postmodern cynicism. You get this sort of like naivete and this idealism in metamodern art, but you also get this like self-reflective, like informed attitude as well. And so it winds up being this sort of new kind of thing that's somehow bringing together aspects of both the modern and the postmodern, and as others would say, and I would agree, also the pre-modern. And all these are kind of in the mix now. And it's like, how do we relate these together in a way that's sort of optimal, I guess would be the question.
How would I recognize metamodern art? Are we talking about a difference in texturing and coloring and the delta between the foreground and the background? What sorts of things are standing out? How would I recognize a metamodern piece of art?
Well, let's use an example, right? I think at this point, kind of the classic example is the film Everything Everywhere All at Once, if you've seen that. It kind of swept the Oscars last year. It was a big kind of breakout film, but it was a very odd film. It doesn't really conform to anything we've really seen before. And so a big part of that is that it's kind of weird and odd and in a bricolage and a kind of mixing together of things in a kind of ironic way that lands in a way that, if you're familiar with postmodern art, has that. But then instead of that just being this cynical, crazy thing, it has this deep heart to it. It has this great sincerity as well. And that it's actually explicitly grappling with issues of meaning and nihilism. Like, do we have meaning? And if so, how do we have it? And, is there an ultimate meaning, or are there just local meanings? And there's a sense of like, maybe there's a degree to which we don't have the meaning that we thought we did, but that doesn't mean that life is meaningless, and etc. So I'd say, yeah, I mean, there's a whole, if people are interested in metamodern art, there's, over a decade now of literature on that topic alone. So you can go check that out. But I think it's a mixture of sort of content, like what issues are being dealt with. I mean, for example, right, like postmodern art is kind of about nothing, like if you look at like Seinfeld, right, it's a show about nothing, and or like The Simpsons, South Park, there's kind of just this cynical irony to everything, and that can be great and it can be a lot of fun, but you're not going to see this like The Simpsons even, and certainly not Seinfeld or certainly not South Park, like getting into issues of meaning and purpose, and like how do we deal with like the senses of alienation and suffering in the world, but move through them and feel a kind of these sorts of things just don't, they're not, I think Larry David said about Seinfeld, right, he's like, if something like if no one hugs and no one learns anything, then that we've done our job, or something like that. It was sort of like, and I think metamodern art is very different. It's like people do learn things and they do hug. If you've seen the show Ted Lasso, for example, right, it's just this, it's this guy who's very earnest and sincere and has values, but when you watch the show, it's not like you're watching Leave It to Beaver. You know that this show is inflected with a self-awareness about this guy having values and whatnot, but that's okay. And that's good. So it's a mixture of this reflectiveness, but also allowing people to be sincere and sort of unreflective. It's finding that balance and that mixture, that integration of all the aspects of, the kind of idealism and the cynicism simultaneously working side by side to do something novel. So that's a big part of metamodern art. But then metamodernism has become much bigger than that. There's a book by Jason and Ananda Josephson Storm called Metamodernism, The Future of Theory, which is a systematic philosophy, which really goes through, in incredible depth and intellectual rigor, the kind of philosophical thinking of postmodernism and moves beyond it. There's the work of Hansi Freinacht, who's developed a kind of metamodern politics and a sort of theory of cultural evolution based on development. There's many works now that have been written that have really fleshed out this sort of paradigm. So I'll pause it there, and then I can talk a little bit about the values and morality question if you're interested.
Yes. So you mentioned sort of this benefit cost sort of ratio, these positives and negatives that happen over each of these different phases of humanity. They each have their pluses, but they also have their drawbacks, that sort of thing. You look at the 1960s. You look at what happened at UCLA during sort of this civil rights type of timing. You look at someone like a Cheryl Harris, who worked with us. I think she was at the law school out there, and basically promoted this advocate, was an advocate for sort of this welfare queen, I think is sort of what they spoke about it back then. Just, kind of sort of the single mom that's got all these kids, that doesn't work. She lives on welfare. And that was the goal. That was the goal back time, because you couldn't work for the slave. You couldn't be the slave to the master. And then, of course, the king or the CEO or the small business owner that owned the gas station, he was the master, and you couldn't do that anymore. And you couldn't subserviate yourself to a man, because you don't need another master. We're not gonna be slaves again. It was that sort of rhetoric. I'm trying to just kind of give you a sense of the way that from what I've read about, that's sort of how the rhetoric played out in a very, very condensed format. So I say that not to be insensitive, but just kind of sort of condense the conversation there. So you have this goodness, this goodness, this idea of being a free woman, which is fantastic. Like, we want all women to be free. No woman should ever be a slave. But the method was sort of a anti-civilization method. It wasn't about civil rights. It was about deconstructing civilization itself by tearing down the family unit. And so you sort of have this evil act, whether she knew it or not, which I suspect she did, this evil act that's sort of covered in good, which is always the perfect delivery system for evil itself. That's what Hitler used, right? He used the purification. Purification is good, but not purification of the races, right? So you have these ideas of things that are good, but they're covering the evil that they intend to be done. It seems like they're always paired. So if I'm transitioning into meta-modernity from there, and I'm trying to sort of remove the evil, but also keep the good, it seems that's a possibility, right? But you probably, just because of what evil is, and again, I hate to keep using this term, but evil just bastardized good. That you really can't remove evil and have anything left. You always have to have a little bit of the good with it. And so walk me through this idea and what you spoke about a second ago, this idea of how you extract the sort of the good things out of each of these different phases of humanity. and how those sort of turn out into our daily lives for someone like me that just sits in an office all day, every day.
Sure. Yeah, and that I can get to that through the value issue. And
Yeah.
briefly, just I will say, so just to the point of, yeah, you brought up, well, there's a lot that you brought up there, and I wouldn't necessarily agree with all those characterizations, but I get what you're getting at. So we, you know, but there's rhetoric, and there's very complex systems at work, obviously, in society. And one of the challenges that we always face, you know, is the degree of nuance and that we can bring to things. And unfortunately, a lot of rhetoric has its own way of radically oversimplifying things in a way that can twist them to be too simplified to the purpose.
Yes. Real quick, I was commenting about rhetoric. So I'm like three degrees removed there.
Sure.
So I'm in the same boat with you. Like, I don't agree with most of what I said as well. But trying to comment about rhetoric. Yes. Go ahead.
And this is also a kind of thing that I think is the way forward for for a metamodern angle, is to try to sink into the nuance, right? We live in a culture very much mediated by memes and by sound bites and all this stuff, and increasingly, again, people are kind of retreating into these bubbles that they feel justified to retreat to because there is no truth, right? So I'll just have my truth, etc. And a lot of that's very, as I say again, kind of very corrosive. And so one of the solutions to that is really to resist oversimplification and to lean into complexity. And that's a big aspect of metamodern thought. And as you do that, a lot of the binaries that seem to present themselves actually do wind up becoming more of a spectrum, right? And you can begin to see how things might be related. And you can also see that, this issue has like 10 nodes at least, right? And if I pull on this one, it moves this one, and this sort of a thing. And so I think a lot of the metamodern discourse is gesturing in that direction, specifically as a kind of response to the brokenness of identity politics discourse and postmodern discourse, because we need to hear each other. We need to speak across these differences, these divides, these mimetic tribes that we're a part of. And trying to do that's very difficult, but it's really valuable. So we want to work with the rhetoric that's there and the sense making that exists, but we also, I think there's a kind of project to help people see more of the humanity in other people and in other groups, and so that's a big part of the metamodern thing. And then to the question about value, which this is directly related to, is something like this, I think. So let's just say in a pre-modern context, value is sort of given, right? It's just like, in a large part, that's rooted in a kind of religious mentality that God created the world, and so God had a plan, so things have a value. God imbued things with value, etc. So value is kind of bestowed, you could say, and it's not really questioned. It's just sort of a given. And there's that kind of hierarchy of value, again, that sort of leads through, human and to king to God and all that. So there's just this value we would say is kind of natural. It just exists. It's given. And that's a lot of what gets critiqued in the modern period, because when you look at things, you don't see their value, right? You can't, I can see what color something is, I can weigh it, these sorts of things, but I can't determine its value in any objective way, the way that modern science wants to determine things. You can't measure value per se, right? And despite the utilitarians trying to do these sorts of things. And so because of that, the kind of conclusion was, value isn't objective. Value's just subjective. It's just in our heads. It's something that we experience. It's a secondary quality that's not out there in the world, right? So it's a very different conception. And because of that, you wind up kind of taking value away from reality and putting it in people's minds. But the danger of that is that now value is just subjective. So who's to determine what is actually valuable, right? Like I liked dinner last night and maybe you hated it, but so then, I guess it doesn't have value. It's all relative, right? So once you subjectify value in that way, it's very easy to just think of it as totally unreal because So at that point, and you're really already deep then into kind of postmodernism and the kind of radical subjective relativization of value and intersubjective relativization of value, which is one of the insights that the postmoderns have. It's not that you and I just have our own values. We actually live in communities that have their own values, and maybe these communities disagree. So I guess one who has more power destroys the other, and then that's all there is to it. So the metamodern approach to this is to appreciate the complexity, which is that actually we are individuals operating in social groups, so that we have values and our groups have values, and these cycle through us essentially. This is a little bit hard to explain, so I'll try my best, but I think it's a really key insight. So John Vervaeke, who's a cognitive neuroscientist and philosopher, popular in this corner of the internet, he talks a lot about transjectivity, which is it's not something isn't objective or subjective, it's transjective. And what that means is that it isn't just in your head, which would be subjective, and it is not out there in the world, but it is a real thing that exists between subjects and objects, right? So like I'm a subject and I have this glass of water here, and I could say, well, what's the value of this glass of water? Well, again, I can weigh it, I can look at it, but I won't find value objectively. And then I have my head here that is like my subjective sense of why it's valuable, but that's relative in a sense, right? And maybe I don't particularly like the taste of water. Maybe I'd rather have a Coke, etc., right? But what's interesting, though, is that as a subject relating to this object, this actually does have value to me because without it, I couldn't live, let's say, right? I need this water. And so if I don't have this water, I don't exist anymore. And so there's a relationship that I am in between me and my environment in such a way that links me in my environment, that the value isn't in my head and it's not in the thing. It's something that emerges transjectively in our relationship to one another. Another maybe better example of this would be things that can really change their value. I don't know what this is, but it's on my desk at the moment. I guess at one point, right, this was like some kind of a chime, right? So you might say, all right, well, the value of this thing is it's a chime, but now it's broken, so maybe it's valueless. Oh, but I can use it as a paperweight. So now it's valuable as a paperweight. And the whole point of this, I could go on and on and on, right, is that the value is contextual. The value shifts depending on the context, but that isn't just leading us to a kind of relativism, the way that maybe like if you read Wittgenstein, it tends to just suggest that, well, okay, then we're all just whatever. It's all contextual. It's all relative. What it does point, though, is that in contexts, things provide certain affordances to us, right? So if my papers are blowing away, and this thing can be a paperweight, then that is of value in that context. And so obviously, when you're talking about papers blowing away, there's not a particular kind of existential urgency to that. But these things do ultimately kind of track down into existential concerns, right? If I don't have water, I do die. If there's a kind of way in which my values are fundamentally rooted in myself as a goal-directed entity that exists in my environment, that I have to have value. And I think Jordan Peterson gets at some of this in an important way, is that every living thing has values. And I think the insights now are starting to seep into the biological sciences, and you're seeing people talking about this much more openly and clearly, is that every living organism is a teleological, goal-directed, value-driven entity, right? Yes. If it's not, then it doesn't exist anymore. If a thing doesn't have values, then nothing is any better than anything else, and then it doesn't exist. And so to exist, you could say, as a living organism, is to entail value. Now, I'm a bit even more, let's say, ambitious, because I actually think that this goes even deeper than living organisms, right? And there's a book I'm writing at the moment that really dives into all this stuff, but it's basically rooted in thermodynamics and the way that energy works to create organized structures. And once you start getting dissipative structures that are using energy to maintain themselves, then you have value. So in a very real way, value is very real. But it's not real in the way that people used to think. And that's kind of the insight, is that value isn't bestowed. It's not subjective. It's transjective. And so it's fundamentally relational. But I think that this is really key. And once we have this idea, then we can start to see that there really are values in the world, and that there are values in groups and communities, and that we can begin to see when things are more valuable than other things, which gets to your question, right? Like, what does this all mean in the man of the street and this sort of a thing? Like, you have to make decisions in your life. You've got to act and will and choose. And those are value decisions. You know, what kind of person do you want to be? What kind of existence do you want to lead? And the kinds of actions that you take are going to have impacts on you that are either going to lead to your flourishing or that are going to lead to your reciprocal narrowing and withering and, yeah. So the kinds of choices that we can take can either lead us towards our opening, our learning, our growing, our developing, our expansive, embrace of new horizons, and the increase in vitality and strength and openness, care for others, etc. Or they can lead to loneliness, alienation, nihilism, sadness, sickness, despair, right? And those are values, and so what we do really does have a big impact on that, and that it's not all relative. So that's how I think this really kind of connects to every single person in a big way. And I think people should know that. It's really crucial, because if people don't know that, then they think that they don't have value and that there are no values, and that actually itself leads to despair and nihilism and loneliness and that sort of a thing. So if we are oriented towards value, but we have the understanding of how it's operating and what it's ultimately about, I think that can really, it's very crucial for our individual flourishing, and it's also crucial for our collective flourishing. Last thing I'll say, because this is all very important stuff.
This is good. This is great. Yeah.
Okay, I've been talking a lot. The last thing I'll say is just that, to pick up a thread I mentioned earlier, we're not individuals in this. I mean, yes, obviously we are individuals in a very important way, but in other ways we're not, right? My whole sense of myself as an individual comes from the culture that I've entered into, and the language that I use and the ideas that I have. I didn't invent my language, but my mind has been shaped by my language. The world I see and the values that I am sensitive to come through my enculturation and my education and my life experience. And all of that has happened in the context of a social world that I am intimately embedded with, right? If you take a baby and you don't raise them in a social world, they don't learn to talk and they don't learn to think in the same way, right? It's like they don't enter into the cultural plane of existence. They're basically still existing at basically our primate animal level, because we need to be socialized into being full individual selves. So once you realize that, my whole identity is bound up with yours and everyone else's that I interact with. Every aspect of my social context is deeply impacting me and informing me, and that I am adjudicating, I am assessing what is valuable in relation to, because I want to be liked. I want to be a good part of that social system. I want to contribute to it. And when I do, I feel good and I feel opening and all this stuff. To use that kind of, let's just say the welfare queen example, right? Like if we take from things and we are not giving back, if we're selfish and not caring, if we're all those negative vices, that has real social impact on us. People talk negatively about us. They use nasty rhetoric, right? And like that itself is a natural consequence of being a social person in a social situation, in a social world that we live in, and having misplaced values. So the big takeaway from all that is that, yeah, of course, being good to other people and compassionate, empathetic, caring is intrinsic to our way of being in the world. And so just because everything is about our viability and flourishing doesn't mean that we're selfish, because we're deeply enmeshed in social situations, and that is part of our transjective environment in which we're operating. So that's my metamodern take on the value question.
No, I love that. I love that. You said that you do not invent language. I will invent some language here in this question here. So, in your stated Vervakianistic view, okay. So Vervakianistically, I'm asking this in that context. Okay, you have the subjective, objective, and you got the transjective. And we're talking about values, and for some of us, we believe that values, kind of, sort of even mathematical, sort of the core idea of value mathematically, is a Platonic thing, sitting, I suspect, outside those three things. How do we, within that context, what do we do with the Platonic there if we think it exists, or do we have to reject that in order to kind of focus on this Trinitarian that points out the transjective?
Well, I'll always emphasize that. When I'm talking about, I'm trying to articulate a new way of thinking that we're calling metamodern, right? And this can then have implications for religion and all these other things, in the same way that there's modern Christianity and postmodern Christianity, etc. So there's metamodern Christianity, there's metamodern religion, all these sorts of things. And no one has to be any of that, right? No one has to be postmodern or modern or anything. And so, I see a lot of value. This clicks. It makes sense to me. And it's the best way that I can make sense of these really important topics like meaning and value in a way that I feel like is propositionally really sound, but also participatorily, speaking of making up words, also
like
really
that.
sound. It also speaks to my soul. All these things, there's a kind of reconstruction that goes on there that I can say, yes, that makes total sense intellectually, and it seems to make sense in an embodied way. It is an idea that itself aids my flourishing. So that being said, all I can speak to or all I am trying to speak to is a metamodern perspective. So,
Okay.
So that being said, I think that from within the metamodern frame, it's hard to maintain notions of Platonic ideals or things outside of reality. And basically what I would say why, right, is that if you go back and you look at the pre-modern sort of cosmology, you get that what Vervaeke calls the two worlds mythology, right? That you've got this supernatural other realm and you've got the world, and this is going on. One of the things that happens with the shift to modernity is that two worlds mythology from the modern perspective kind of collapses. You get one world, and it's the natural world. And it's actually only with the modern naturalistic turn that you get the invention of a term like supernatural, which is then kind of derided as being, kind of not true. Now that's a closed view of things. That's a very maybe overly simplistic, and it doesn't do full justice to all the depths of pre-modern thought. But there is something to it where once you're working with a singular frame of a one world mythology, you could say, one world frame, that's when a lot of that causality starts to make sense. And you see natural laws, natural forces, these sorts of things. And so there isn't, even from the modern period, anything sort of sitting up and above from the natural, because the natural is the real. I talked to John and Greg Enriquez a little bit about this in the Transcendent Naturalism series and maybe somewhere else. But a big thing that is kind of an emphasis here is that the real is the natural. And so if God is real, if religion, if spirituality, if the sacred, if these are real, then these have to be natural. And this might be a controversial idea, but I think it's actually really important. And it's the sort of thing that I'm really trying to encourage people thinking about in terms of metamodern spirituality. So from this frame, you've got a one world. And then of course the postmodern kind of, attenuates that in various ways. But the general insight there then is that, we need to be working with a form of naturalism, even if we're accounting for transcendence. And I wrote a book called, in a part of that 7-volume series you mentioned at the outset, it's a book called Metamodernism and the Return of Transcendence. And the whole thesis basically is that you can look at the move from modernity into postmodernity as being the sort of gradual removing of the idea of transcendence entirely from the cultural discourse. And then in many ways, postmodernism represents a kind of apex of sort of modern disenchantment and secularization. But metamodernism then reconstructs the very notion of what we mean by transcendence, because it sees transcendence as operating naturalistically within the immanent frame. And so, without getting too jargony and philosophical, it's a very short book though, and hopefully it's intelligible. I think that a lot of metamodern spirituality is about relating to this one universe that we inhabit and seeing the divine and the sacred and the transcendent in that. And we do. It's a transcendent universe. There are levels to reality, and you can level up, and you can see things from new vantages, and you can, and in fact, when you do, we experience that as sacred. And you could even say that the end or goal or orienting telos of that very process itself is, I think, okay and very justified to call God. But it's a different conception of God. It's not God sitting outside of space and time. It's God kind of somehow within the world, or the world within God, or something like that. So
God is being itself.
And there
not
are various,
a being, but the constitution of being.
Right. Or maybe God is the background context that allows for things to be, or something like that. There are different ways of framing this, and asking those questions and trying to do that sort of formulation of thought is some kind of metamodern theology. But once framed in that term, it becomes very difficult then to try to look for Platonic values and absolute terms, because that's inherently what a transjective framing is sort of redescribing for us. And I think that what it does is it makes value real and it makes value natural, and so that's essential. But it doesn't do it in the old way. It does it in this new transjective framing.
Okay. So let me set up a question for you about this idea about real and the Platonic and the transjective, just so I can get my head around it. And so I don't know if I heard this somewhere, so I may be stealing this concept from somebody. So I apologize, whoever the dead person is that came up with this. But if I kind of imagine a world where the only thing that exists is two red apples. And those are the only two things, and the two apples just get destroyed. They get obliterated. There's nothing left, and there's nothing left in all existence. I still have sort of this idea of an apple. There was an apple that once existed, and I also have this concept of the numerical two, and so those two things sort of have a memory about them, and the number two is always true, right? If I go to my daughters and I ask them, do you want to have an apple for lunch? They're always thinking about a symmetrical red shiny apple, a little bit bigger than they can bite. They're thinking about the little stem kind of curling off up and to the right. It's always the exact same thing you imagine when you hear about an apple, and for kids and also for witches. But you also have this idea of two. And so from my perspective, this is just me, kind of the uneducated brute from Texas. From my perspective, I'm thinking to myself, well, like, what's more real, the two apples that once existed or the concept of the number two? And I'm thinking of like the way that I want to identify real as being something that is less apt to being destroyed. And if something is indestructible, like the idea of an apple, like the idea of the quantity of two, that those are more real than the two apples that once existed. Mm-hmm. Where am I going wrong? Like, what's...
Yeah, that's great. It's a great question. And by the way, obviously, I know you're self-disparaging in an ironic way, but you're vastly undervaluing your capacities here. So I just wanted to give you credit. I never like hearing people use bad self-talk. You got it. No, but I know you're kidding. It's a great question. So here would be the way I respond to that. When you created this thought experiment, you said there's only two things in existence, two apples, and now they're gone, and now I'm here and I remember two apples and I have this memory. And it's like, well, wait a second. Your thought experiment said that there's only two things in existence, two apples. So who's this you who has these
who's this
thoughts?
Observer? That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this is actually really important, because who is the observer is kind of one of the things that you could say particularly postmodern thought draws our attention to, right? Modern science wants to have this view from nowhere, this sense of even if there were no observers in the universe, this thing would still exist, right? But that's something that observers are talking about, right? And so they're not taking themselves into account to their own thing. So you get that. So then you have to think, okay, well, wait a second. So this whole observer thing seems like I'm presuming that, and in some ways, then you're presuming the very thing you're trying to argue for. And so then we have to kind of dig into that. Now, what's really interesting though is that when you think about an observer, let's just say a mind, right? How does a mind gain knowledge of number? So when developmental psychologists developed theories of learning in the late 1800s and early 20th century, and have since perfected in many ways in the latter 20th century and early 21st centuries, there is a sense that we get now of how this operates, which is that actually numbers are abstractions that we internalize based on actions. Right. So the very number two that you can have in your head, you can only do that because you were once a baby that maybe had two little plastic apples. Right. And then you put one next to the other. And then now there's these two things here. Right. But you did that enough times that you kind of made a mental schema in your mind that's two. But that mental schema doesn't exist outside of the experience that you had of these two apples. So in terms of asking what's prior, you could say that the experience, the physical embodied observer experience, was prior to the development of an abstract concept like two. One of the great, you could say, errors. I mean, to put it bluntly, let's just say one of the great, I'll just put it that way because I've already said it. One of the great errors of Platonic thinking is to kind of put the cart before the horse, right? Is that basically Plato was a baby and he came up through his developmental trajectory. He then came up with an abstract idea in his head. Well, didn't come up with it, but through his experience got an abstract concept in his head, a mental schema for two. And then he thinks about that two and he's like, this is more real than any apples. But it's actually that two is based on the apples that generated the mental schema. And so the big takeaway from all this would be that the physical, the material, the embodied is fundamentally prior to the conceptual, the abstract. And if you, get into studying, which I'm really into at the moment, a lot of learning theory and the kind of experiential basis for a lot of this stuff, then we can actually chart how this unfolds for people, what's called genetic epistemology. Like, where does knowledge come from? What's its genesis? And Piagetian thinking and neo-Piagetian thinking basically answers that, over time we construct increasingly complex mental schemas based on our experience. And so I think that does a great job of resolving in many ways the Platonic issue.
And so if we go and lean on someone like a Wigner, and of course Wigner's famous article, The Unreasonableness of Mathematics, opens with a statement by Bertrand Russell talking about the corollary between mathematics and poetry. They function the same way. Right? And so, I realize I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I'm kind of we're in the entertainment business today for the people.
No, this is great.
and so if I sort of had that idea that there's some element of beauty to the mathematics, like there's something beyond the sheer mere numbers, and I destroy even the observers. I destroy every observer that's ever existed after those two apples that have existed in a billion years. When a new cell forms and new life begins to form and propagate, and there begins to be some complexity that evolves, their definition of the two is still going to be the same as my definition.
Yep. Yeah. And and so how would I put it? So the notion that all right, here's the best way. So the reality exists, let's put it that way. And by reality, we mean this naturalistic cosmos that we inhabit, right? But it's from reality that our minds form the mental concepts of two, okay? And so even though, yes, two things on a table is real, there isn't a reality to two-ness as a thing, right? It's an abstraction that we have sort of taken from what is real. And that's not to say that there's not an abstract reality, I guess you could say, to two, but it's to say that abstraction comes, we map it off of the real world, the naturalistic world. It's not that it precedes the natural world. Now, at the same time, though, this doesn't really fully solve the issue because we're still stuck with a world and where did that come from? And, there's a kind of coherency to it and a logic to it, we could say. And so I'm not trying to suggest that a kind of radical empiricist stance that like you need a mind for there to be reality or any of that. I think that, again, this gets to the transjective thing, right? That we have experience and we are a part of reality. And what we're always doing is conforming our minds to reality. And then we're using the schemas that we use that we've conformed ourselves to then understand reality. And so it's this continual back and forth of like making shapes that we can look through to understand our experience. And then when those shapes don't work, then we alter them. And then when they do work, great. But then when they don't work, then we alter them further. And so this is how development unfolds through assimilation and accommodation. Yeah.
So it seems to me that our definitions of real are almost opposite. Because you're talking about a definition of real as something that has some sort of corollary with the natural world and destructibility. Like almost, if it's destroyable, then it could be real. And I'm on the opposite spectrum that the more undestroyable it is, the more real it is. Is that a fair assessment, or correct me?
Not quite, though. I hear what you're saying. A couple things. One, in that work I mentioned earlier, Metamodernism by Jason Storm, he has a whole discussion on how we talk about real and what this really means. And he's very, I think, insightful to recognize that when we talk about real, it's always a contrasting term. So there isn't anything that's absolutely real. What we mean by real is always contextual, and it's sort of like relative to what we're discussing. And so that's just worth mentioning. But what I would actually say is this, is that the number 2 is actually very easily destructible, because all you have to do is, as you say, like destroy human minds, right? Which, aren't super abundant in the cosmos. And you'll still have 2 apples, but you won't have the concept 2. The concept 2 is, as far as we know, a mental formulation that we do in our brains, as an abstraction based off of real experience. Or I'll try to be careful about how I use the word real. Let's just say, physical experience, right? And so actually to destroy 2 is much easier than to destroy the physical universe, right? But that would be, again, to try to, we're flipping carts and horses here. It's sort of about what's, right? It's the position that you're advocating for is idealism, which is that it takes a mind as being sort of ontologically fundamental in some way, that the idea of 2 is somehow more fundamental than 2 things. But again, that idea comes from the mind of Plato, and it comes from the minds, and it inhabits the minds of other people like Plato. And so the mind, now this starts to enter on some really interesting philosophical terrain here around emergence of when does mind emerge in the evolutionary process, that sort of a thing. I take the emergentist view at the moment anyway, though I'm open to other kinds of panpsychic approaches, but I see that mind emerges at a particular point in the evolutionary process. And so actually, yeah, it would be much easier to eradicate 2-ness from reality than it would be to eradicate the stuff that 2-ness is based off of, if that makes sense.
Yes. And so, all right, that's helpful. That's helpful. All right. So what are a couple of things that we need to know about your work? I want to hear a little bit more about the Institute, Sky Meadow Institute, and what your work is there. And I also want to hear about farming as well before we run out of time here.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for asking, and thanks for, again, this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun. And my work is about meaning, really. The more I'm thinking about what unites all the stuff that I'm up to, it's ultimately about meaning. How do we live lives of meaning that are, very intellectually honest, and yet also deeply psychologically, socially fulfilling, and not just that, but like that root us in reality again. Yeah, my work has been sort of dedicated to the project of meaning, and what do we do when we experience the loss of meaning? How and why do we experience the loss of meaning? What is meaning? Again, like, where does it come from? Where do our values come from? All of that. So yeah, I'm currently working on this book that'll be quite extensive, but it's called The Evolution of Meaning, and that'll be my project for some time. But if people are interested in the other things that I've done that are sort of in this wheelhouse, I have a podcast, Metamodern Spirituality. I would just direct people to my YouTube channel, and I guess you could just go to my website that has all the stuff there, brendangrahamdempsey.com. So there I'm really trying to advocate for metamodern perspectives on these big issues. I think we've been stuck. I've experienced that stuckness personally, and I think that we're experiencing it collectively. And I think that, and here's the other big thing. A big aspect of my work is I want to help people avoid kind of running backwards away from the problems that we face. What I mean by that is, yeah, it's a pretty terrifying thing when you're engaging modern critical ideas and they seem to undermine your notions of value. Yeah, it's a pretty terrifying and disturbing thing when you're up against postmodern deconstruction and these sorts of things, right? And I think that as a very natural response to that, people will just say, no, thank you. And they'll then want to basically, not deal with those issues. But I'm of the mind that dealing with those issues one, on the other side of them is something very positive and still very meaningful, profoundly meaningful, and I think more deeply meaningful because it lands as more deeply true. And so I want to invite people to continue thinking, asking, questioning, exploring, deepening what I perceive to be a spiritual journey. The spiritual life is about trying to come into deeper communion with, and then we can say God. And I would say God is real. God is reality. God is how you want to language that, people might use different terms for, and that's fine. But I don't shy away from God language. So let's just say God for the time being. If we're about moving into deeper communion with God, and God is more real than anything else, then we should be welcoming of deepening into reality. And therefore, no amount of critical scrutiny or questioning or inquiry needs to scare us. It doesn't need to frighten us. We don't have to fear falling away. I know a lot of people, especially in more theological circles, are concerned about the ways that maybe the devil can trick people into following the intellectual life and then losing their faith and this sort of a thing. My experience, I understand that perspective. I was raised very much in that perspective, but I also think, let's put it this way, that God also calls us to deepen into question, deepen into mystery, deepen into curiosity, and learning. And so I think that we can actually learn more about God, and I think that we can deepen into relationship through that learning. And so that requires, continually probing, engaging, asking questions, dealing with the cognitive dissonances of like, oh, I didn't think it was like that, and like, what do I do now? It's a long process, and it's not easy, but no one said that the spiritual life is easy. I think the story of Jesus is all the evidence you need of that. So that's really what I would say my work is about, is trying to encourage people to deepen into meaning by allowing themselves sometimes to deconstruct older forms of meaning and to enter into more expansive ones that ultimately serve them better and serve their flourishing, and therefore are more in touch with value. And because I've been through that myself, and because I've gone through various iterations of that, I can speak to it personally. And I'm just trying my best to formulate these ideas for people so that, I can kind of be of service to others.
That's very helpful, very helpful. And I want to make a comment. I don't expect a reply out of this unless you feel you want to make a reply here. It seems to me that you are serving a very critical function. I have a little bit of a background in the apologetics world, and that your function seems to be pre-evangelistic in nature. Do you know what that pre-evangelistic term means? I mean, is that
unpack that a little bit.
Okay, so generally, if I'm going to have a conversation with someone, I admit I'm a Christian. If I'm going to have a conversation with someone that I know is from a very difficult background to directly, even consider the kind of the concept or the person of Christ, I'm going to talk to them a little bit about their life. I'm going to try to figure out what those roadblocks are, and I realize that my role is not to convert them, right? Most of the time, my role might be to help them think through one or two of the roadblocks, one or two of the walls, and then if I can get them a little bit closer, I'm done a lot of the times. And so that's sort of a work of pre-evangelism, the idea of setting out the idea of morality, of talking a lot about the Nazis and the international war tribunals and the nature of humanity has a coalesced around an idea of what evil really is. We've defined it. We know that we do it, and we have history to prove it, and that's enough for that on that topic, because we're just about breaking down a wall here or there. Do you consider yourself, say, maybe someone that breaks down certain walls, but maybe doesn't try to break down all the walls in certain contexts?
So it's funny, and I'm not saying this to be cute. I think it's actually I had the term hadn't occurred to me before, but I think it's fitting. I would actually say that I'm more like post-evangelistic, meaning that, maybe it's clear what that means, but I would suggest that. So I come from an evangelical background,
yes,
and also was deep into apologetics for some time, so I'm familiar with that kind of process. In my own spiritual journey, I've come to see that that approach can itself be sort of reflected on, and you can kind of come to a kind of a more expansive vantage that sort of, I think, let's say, shifts the urgency or the kind of meaning that an activity like that poses, and you can actually see it from a different angle in a way that makes you say, oh, it's actually more important that we do X, Y, and Z. Now, I do think that there are truths. Some truths are more helpful for people than others, and hence more valuable, right? Meaning if we are misoriented towards value, if we've misgauged value, and if we're in that downward spiral, right? Like we're off about reality in a meaningful way. And so to that degree, it's important that we try to articulate the perspectives that we think are most helpful and beneficiary for people. So I'm not against evangelism in that sort of broader sense, right? Any kind of philosophical perspective that thinks it has, a more satisfactory answer to a particular problem will kind of evangelize its perspective to that degree. And we need that. That's part of the public sphere of conversation, back and forth, discourse, etc. So I'm not against evangelism in that sense. But I do see it from a broader perspective in that sense, right? It's not necessarily so much about trying to get someone to break down barriers in their thinking so as to have the telos of getting them to convert to Christ. It's more about how can I help people navigate their experience in a way where they can get back on a kind of track that is more oriented towards transjective value in a way that is for their own flourishing, which are very different kinds of projects. But because of my own biography of having sort of moved through that evangelical mode and then beyond it, I wouldn't situate myself as a kind of, as doing kind of pre-evangelical work, if that makes sense.
Okay. That's fair. What do you farm?
Where do I farm?
No, what do you farm? What crops?
Well, garlic is a big one. We have Sky Meadow garlic, which is our kind of staple crop, meaning that's like, that's probably the stuff that's like the best, that we do. But potatoes, cabbage, carrots, kale, lettuce, spinach, tomatoes, beans, lots of peas, kind of you name it. You know, we've got like, I think it's a garden plot of 40 by 80 or something. No. It's 20 by 40, something like that. So it's a pretty big plot. And so we grow a lot of stuff. We try to grow most of our food, or most of our vegetables, I should say, for the winter. And, we got a root cellar. And so we got our carrots and beets and potatoes down there. And, but yeah, our garlic is, mwah.
Yeah. So I'm married to a farmer, farmer's daughter, but yeah, she owns some farmland down in South Texas. They're more cotton, corn, jalapeno type of ground down there. I'd say so. Funny thing, when you go I first found myself in this farming community when I'm sort of early 20s. I'm cocky. I'm in college, right? I'm ready to conquer the world. I know everything and so my wife has me meet the farmers at kind of the local ranch motel restaurant for lunch, and so I go in there. I lecture these farmers about business and economics and all this kind of stuff. I'm the smartest guy in the world, and they're sitting there just letting me run my mouth, just run my mouth. And I get up and she said, Rick, you realize all those farmers are worth tens of millions of dollars each. The one that was at that table, they just let you talk because they want you to think that you're the smartest person in the transaction. And everything's a transaction. And I found the exact same thing in the Vedic community as well. That the more quiet they are, the more they want you to think that you're the smartest person in the room. The more they can talk, the more advantage they have in sort of negotiating the conversation, negotiating the relationship as they go along. And so I think it sort of rubbed off on me, the self-deprecating types of remarks. I'm not a philosopher, but I sort of rubbed off on me. You caught me a few minutes ago on that. But I picked it out very, very early that these guys that were the next generation ahead of me that had way more money, way more success, they were quiet and I was cocky. And so I tried to pivot over time. I still have to let my cockiness peek out every once in a while, but the farmers are the first ones that kind of taught me that trick to sort of navigating the world.
I think it's well, gosh, there's a lot of wisdom in silence. There's a lot of wisdom in restraint. I also, I mean, I do the self-deprecatory thing as well, or at least, right. I think there's a difficulty of trying to navigate your own worth in the eyes of others in a social situation. And I think that's always been difficult for people to navigate. And an easy way of sort of like getting out ahead of that is just sort of always undercutting yourself.
Yes.
But the problem with that is that, you don't want to undercut yourself all the time, because you also have a lot to offer, and everyone has, has a lot to offer. But in your sense, I mean, it's very, I wouldn't have thought. Actually, here's an interesting social insight, which is that if another person is particularly self-deprecating as a kind of gesture towards others, then there's a kind of reciprocal need, I think, to meet their self-deprecation with an invitation to not self-deprecate as an attempt to, like, you know what I mean? But this is funny, right? A lot of people don't overthink these kinds of things, but I think one of the one of the meaningful things I think that comes out of, let's say, evangelical or even apologetics framings is that you do try to enter the perspective of people that you're talking to. You're trying to get to, trying to get in their shoes, right? Because otherwise your words aren't going to land. And so I think that, though, that's a very powerful and meaningful tool more broadly to try to inhabit other people's perspectives, and to see the world from another person's eyes. I think when you radicalize that in a way, I'll put it this way. Yeah, I think when you radicalize that, you also come to peace with letting people be who they are as well, as long as they're flourishing, I guess, is kind of the thing. And of course, there's a lot of theological stuff mixed up with this, which we'd need another many hours to get into, right? Because some people can seem flourishing on the outside, but then, there's all this stuff going on there. And of course, theologically speaking, from kind of more theological angles, you could say, well, someone's doing well in the world, but if they don't have Christ, then they're in trouble. So there's a lot of metaphysics that goes on in terms of how we assess, whether someone's flourishing or not. But I guess I guess I would just try to throw that out as a seed, speaking of farming, of like, as someone, I think particularly myself, who was really concerned with relationships, to try to take their perspective so that I could evangelize. There's a kind of transactionalism, to use the word you just brought up, that goes along with that can wind up getting in the way, actually, of maybe what the deeper gospel is about, which is like, showing up and kind of being a Jesus figure and just like loving on people. And so I remember reading, I think it was some Donald Miller that kind of helped me with that one. I think Blue Like Jazz. I found that book when I was really into apologetics and evangelical sort of spreading the word and that sort of a thing. And so many of the people that he's talking to and in his social orbit are just, in a totally different place. He's at Reed College. It's just this, and he actually winds up learning a lot from them in a way that I think is both ironic but also powerful. And so, yeah, that's another aspect which we don't have much time to get into, and it didn't get into much, but in terms of thinking about how metamodernism can be inflected through the Christian lens, right? Like, what does that mean? A big thing that I try to bring to that conversation is how can we expand further the basic insights that are in germ form in some of these kind of Christian frames, and try to make them even more Christian-like, even radicalize their Christ-like orientation. And sometimes that can look very different than what we think Christianity can look like. But that's a whole other topic, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I will leave this to document this. So your next book after Emergentism that comes out, that you're going to title Vervacianistically Thinking. That's going to be the next title.
Yeah.
I want one half of every penny
Yes,
Uh,
you'll get
that's-
the
that's-
royalties. I will. You'll be the only name in the acknowledgments page. No, it's a brilliant coinage. I'll put a TM after it too. It's trademarked.
Yes, definitely. Brenda, thanks so much. Appreciate it. We're gonna link to your Amazon page and also your website and your social channels down below as soon as we got the line. I think Angelina can do that. But I encourage everyone to pick up the new book, Emergentism: A Religion of Complexity for the Metamodern World, on Amazon. It's not out. It's not out yet.
No, I was just going to say, I think probably I would recommend probably for your audience, Metamodernism or the Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics. And I think that will be a lot more germane for, I know people are really interested in metamodern Christianity and these sorts of things and all that value. And also, Vervaeke's mentioned in that book as well. The Emergentism book would be, I would say, read the Metamodernism book first. And if you're still interested, then you can go for the Emergentism book. But yeah.
Yeah. And make sure you listen to it with your Google music playing Dua Lipa in your ears. That's the best way to do it. And speaking of gods, let Uncle Bernie know that I did marry a farmer, that I'm in the process of tearing down my business, tearing down the house, and we'll be living in tents pretty soon down here in Texas as
he's
as
coming
would be
for
acceptable
you.
to him. He is. Man, I love. If I could have a drink with anyone, it would be Bernie and it would be Bill Clinton. And actually, Bill Clinton bought me dinner one time. I'll tell you that story next time here. But just two of the best politicians I've ever seen. They're magnificent with people, and I really appreciate it. But we shouldn't be talking about politics. That's inappropriate.
Next time.
Yes. Brendan, thanks so much. Sure appreciate it. Enjoyed it. Thanks everyone for joining us. Be sure to follow Brendan on all the social channels and click on the link that we'll put it in the description. But appreciate everyone for being with us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Rick. Appreciate it.